Thank you so much. My name is Kitasei. I'll be leading a really interesting conversation between four fascinating people with very different perspectives on this question of why problems, some of the very sticky and persistent problems that we've been talking about this morning, can be so difficult to tackle at the systems level. I have with me, and I'll introduce them in more detail as we come to them, an economist, a politician, an astronaut, someone who described himself this morning to me as a recovering IT guy. And it feels like one of those, and these people walk into a bar kind of jokes. So we'll see, I think, in the space that we can have this interesting conversation, what types of different perspectives we can bring to this big question of how systems can change. So I want to go first to you, Yanis, and as, of course, Minister of Finance for Greece in 2015, you've had really a front row seat to how painful transition can be, especially when we're talking about big economic changes. What do you think are some of the biggest barriers to seeing these systems change from your perspective?
Gross political failure. This, I think, is the greatest scourge of humanity at the moment. I would like to use my short space of time to talk to you about a most peculiar failure. In the West, as we speak, we have a remarkable situation. We have the highest level of savings in the history of humanity. Never before, if you take the West altogether, did we have the degree of accumulated cash that we have today. And at the same time, we have, of course, gigantic debt, which is incongruous, given that we have this mountain of cash, and the lowest level of investment in infrastructure in the history of humanity as a proportion of total income. Consider that. The greatest savings ever, the lowest level of investment in the things that humanity needs, in particular, green infrastructure, green energy. So businesses are doing remarkable things. Technologists are inventing amazing technologies. We, as citizens, are getting to feel the need for, how did Chester put it, reinventing growth. And yet, we have this imbalance. The reason we have this imbalance is because we have had a series of market failures in the financial sector. I'm not going to go into this. And then, immediately after that, the same politicians that failed to contain the financial genie after the collapse of the financial sector failed to do that which was necessary to stop this incongruity between savings and investment from growing. The failure is political, the solution must be political, but it will only come if we move away from the trend of the last 30 years, especially in Europe, of trying supposedly to depoliticize political decision-making by turning over important decisions to a technocracy and redemocratizing political decision-making, because let's face it, democracy is not a luxury. It's what we need in periods of crisis.
So, Aili, you are the president of the Sámi parliament, and some of these points that Yanis has made about bringing a different kind of democracy back into the decision-making is something that you work very closely with. When you think about growth and some of its unintended consequences in the place where you and your community live, what are some of the biggest challenges that you think the rest of us fail to see?
Well, I represent an indigenous people in the Nordic states and northwest Russia, and forgive me for not totally embracing the idea of reinventing growth, because we have some experience about who gets to define what is growth. So what might be growth for you guys might be decline for me and my people. We are now talking about green growth, which is supposed to be the answer to the climate change and environmental problems, the answer to where growth got us today. But to us, it might be green colonialism, because the land grabbing of our homelands is continuing, but now in the name of climate change, because we need minerals to the new technology. We need power to the new technology. So every driving force in the green growth is also a threat to an indigenous culture like our culture.
And Christer, you've also come from a background where, as an astronaut with the European Space Agency, you've seen the ways that sometimes the investments that Yanis is describing can actually work and drive huge progress. And in the sustainability space, talking about the SDGs, we often hear the word moonshot being used as the sort of ideal of coming together and innovating around mobilizing massive public resources around some really big, ambitious goal. So what has your experience been watching this unfold in the space context? Is there something special about space that makes it easier to drive big systems change?
Well, let me start with what I think is maybe one of the biggest defining moments in humanity, which is coming up on a 50-year jubilee now, just a few weeks. The first time humans not only left the surface of the Earth, but even left the vicinity of Earth. I went all the way to the moon with Apollo 8. And they went around the moon and they came back on the other side, and they saw this little blue Earth rising over the horizon of the moon. And they took this iconic photo called Earth Rise. And it was kind of by going to the moon, humanity discovered Earth. We discovered how our little planet here is something very small in the huge universe. So sometimes I would say you have to go away to understand what you have there. Now, another interesting aspect with the Apollo program is I often get the question of, why haven't we been back to the moon? What's really interesting with that question is everybody says, we've been back to the moon. Who went to the moon? Well, it was the Americans. But everyone want to be part of this because it was such a big endeavor. And Americans, they went to the moon because they had to show themselves and the world that they were better than the communist Soviet Union. And there was a race going on. That, in some extent, was actually a continuation of the Cold War. So they didn't go to the moon to explore the moon. They went there to show that they could beat the communists. And so that could really gather all the resources and the people in the United States at the time to kind of do this. Now, on the other hand, today we have the International Space Station, which is, on the other side, one of the best examples of a really good international collaboration, where the former enemies, now Russia and the United States, together with Europe and Canada and Japan, has made extremely successful collaboration in space, both technologically and politically. And it's really been stabilized, although this moving towards kind of Cold War again on the Earth up there, still work very well together. And indeed, a couple of years ago, the International Space Station was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. They didn't win it, but at least was nominated on an analogy how the European Union was kind of awarded it. Well, I guess my time is out now, right?
You're all being very disciplined. I appreciate that. So, Christer, I think it's so interesting, this idea that you have to kind of step back away from the system to really understand how big it is and how complex. And when we first met, Jim, you started to talk a little bit about what it feels like being here in Norway, and for you working for Verizon as the Chief Sustainability Officer, seeing how sustainability is handled at corporate levels in European organizations.
Yeah, it's definitely. Well, first, Saya, Brendan, and the entire exchange, thank you so much. This is an awesome opportunity, and the event already is off to a great start. We take a lot of pride in a leadership position of the fourth industrial revolution. At Verizon, we're focused on connectivity for good. So things like 5G, autonomous vehicles, AI. And it was very interesting because when we heard some of the earlier conversations about infrastructure, and Yanis mentioned it and others, we see 5G as really one of those enablers. And I appreciate all the comments about business, but when you look at that infrastructure and what has to be done, one of the things that we take a lot of pride in is 5G's enablement of remote surgeries. We look just in the US alone, over 47 million people live more than an hour from a trauma center. The ability to do a remote surgery across town or across the world is truly changing the human gap tremendously. And then you look at what wealthier countries take for granted and what we have, remote surgery, infrastructure of 5G, all those things are things that are going to change, and technology for good is really going to change that. There's also risks, though, and we have to recognize that. Being a business, we have to look at jobs. How quickly is AI and automation changing the job front? And how are we actually starting the educational system differently? So this exchange, the next 2 days here, we're really excited to really put those challenges out there, because we feel that some of the things we're doing from a technology perspective, focusing on enablement, really the solutions aren't even there yet, but we know the infrastructure is being put in place.
So one of the things, so as you've just said, Verizon is deep in the midst of the transition to 5G. And one of the things that I think was really interesting about how you framed this for me earlier today was the idea that you have the technologies in place, but that doesn't translate into solutions right away. So what helps us bridge that gap? What makes a technology into a solution?
Well, it's interesting because we've really taken a leap, and we have put our full focus on 5G. It is mind-boggling, just the capabilities. And I say that, and I have 5 children, and I'm always talking to them about what the future looks like. I can't comprehend the way they're looking at the future. They don't even think about the way you and I, or many of us, learned. 5G's technology infrastructure, the solutions aren't even going to be made. The conversations that are going to happen here over the next 24 hours are even going to be different by the time we talk about them again in 6 months or this time next year. So that's that shift. And that's where you have to bring governments, business, academics, and you have to look at a fundamental change in the way we look at the history. It's no longer a 12-month cycle. In some cases, it's a 12-day cycle, or in some cases, it's a 5-year cycle, and that infrastructure is the key.
So, Yanis, given this pace of technological change that we're talking about, is it possible for policy to keep up? Is it possible for our economic systems to be able to adapt and control and regulate some of the kinds of things we're talking about?
Absolutely. Well, of course, there is a chasm between what is possible and what is likely. And whether the possible becomes a reality is up to us. Every single citizen has a responsibility for this. 5G technology is fascinating. I'm a tech maniac. But we have to recognize the fact that we are now discovering solutions to problems that we have not created yet, and we have not imagined yet. While at the same time, problems that we know that are here, we are not solving. So this is another incongruity that we must address. And again, we cannot do this either through the hierarchical system of governance, of our political systems, or of Dutch companies like Google that are becoming like little Soviet unions in terms of top-down decision-making, or through a complete market decentralization. We need new innovative ways of democratizing both business and politics.
Aili, I can see you're itching to jump in here.
Well, we cannot automatically presume that everyone can reach these technological solutions. We are not all in the advantage of speaking a world language like English. My language, Northern Sámi, is a really small language.
So is mine.
Even smaller. And I do not have a government like you have. Okay, that is a different kind of problem. But we cannot automatically...
We are in the same situation.
Hardly. We cannot not suppose that everyone has access to this wonderful new technology, and the indigenous peoples, the indigenous cultures and languages of the world, we are lagging behind. It's a gap. We do not have access to this. My phone do not speak my language. My phone doesn't even speak Norwegian, and that's another issue. But the small languages of the world are lagging behind in the technological development, and that is scary to me, because what will happen to my culture and language in the future? We might survive as individuals, But will we survive as peoples and culture? I'm not sure. It's disturbing.
It's really interesting, Aili, and I think somehow between what both of you have said, to me there seems like a kind of two-part tension between, on the one hand, what it means or what we think it means to be too big to fail, and on the other, to be too small to succeed. And this idea that these languages actually, they don't have enough volume to be able to work for the kinds of technologies that some of us have been talking about is, I think, one that we haven't yet begun to think about how to grapple with. And Christer, I was remembering that you were telling me this, one of the fascinating things about Christer's history is that he actually spent some years training in the Soviet Union, just as the Soviet Union was ceasing to exist, to become an astronaut, and studying Russian, in fact, in order to be able to collaborate in contexts such as the ISS, as you were saying. So do you feel like that kind of experience now is, what will we lose when that becomes less essential as part of the way that we work together?
You mean how you learn other cultures or languages, or?
You talked about the ISS as an example of international collaboration that we aren't often very good at.
No, when we need to learn to collaborate more. That is for sure. And by traveling and working in other places, I think that's very important. And to truly understand other culture, you need to understand the language. Well, I didn't learn language because I really wanted to understand the culture. It was great to get it, but I had to learn the language because they were teaching me how to use this Soyuz capsule in Russian, and I needed to understand it. So kind of was forced to it. But by the way, I mean, I want to pick up on one thing you think, because to some extent here we say problems to progress, but what you're saying is that we have a progress here which creates a problem, right? I mean, isn't that kind of a little bit funny background? Because we have progress and some groups cannot keep up with that progress as fast as others, we create a new problem.
Well, and that is also the problem of climate change, because climate change is creating problems for indigenous peoples today. We are losing our livelihoods. We are mostly nature-based. We have nature-based livelihoods, and we are losing our livelihoods. And then the world invents the solution for climate change, like wind power plants in our reindeer herding areas, or mining to extract minerals in our reindeer herding areas. So we don't only have the problem of climate change, we have the problem also of the solution. Double up. It's a heavy burden to carry for small peoples.
So Yanis, this idea of progress that doesn't leave people behind, is that a pipe dream, do you think?
It's a question of ownership. It's a question of ensuring that we end this cycle of 200 years of colonialism. Those of us who are familiar with Australia or Canada, we know exactly the crimes against humanity perpetrated in the name of progress by the West. And your peoples are experiencing exactly the same thing. Whether we are in our proto-colonial spirit or now, as you said, in the process of trying to sort out our mess in Europe, in Canada, in the United States, we're exporting, again, our rubbish to the Arctic Circle. So the question is property rights over habitats, over communities, over resources that are decentralized and at the same time centrally defended.
And property rights aren't something that necessarily a lot of indigenous people grew up natively believing in, is that right?
Well,
property rights in terms of community property rights. Not individual property rights.
But of course, land right is in the core of indigenous policies, both for the indigenous peoples, but also for the governments who try to rule our homelands. So that is a core issue, of course, because with land rights also come some kind of fate control. You know, some kind of control of your future. If we have to adapt to a new world, a new climate, we need to control our resources, because how would we else be able to manage on our homelands? So even if property rights is not what I believe in, I think we have to get our land rights acknowledged to be able to adapt to a different future.
And Jim, we talked about speaking different languages and coming from different tribes with different vocabularies in a way. Sitting in this, so Verizon, number 16 in the Fortune 500, I think ownership is a concept that capitalism understands very well.
Right.
How hard do you think it is to collaborate with non-business actors in spaces where some of these very fundamental beliefs are not shared?
I think it's gotten much, much easier over the last several years. I think the United States really had taken a back seat to where Europe and the Scandinavian companies had really been thinking about sustainability much more advanced than we had in the United States. We do not have policy that there is in other parts of the world. But taking that conversation to the boardroom had been challenging. I will say a huge benefit to Verizon right now is our new chairman and CEO, Hans Vesterberg, is right here from Stockholm. And he gets it at his core DNA, and he's helping us build it into the rest of the company. But that intersection between corporate social responsibility and day-to-day business and profits and meeting that Wall Street expectation and shareholder value, that's the whole solution. And I think that conversation has really changed at Verizon, and that's why we take so much pride in that leadership position that we have. And from our 150,000 people all around the world, we're trying to build it in day to day across the board. And now the conversations turn from just pure technology advances to connectivity for good. And that's the conversation that's really changed.
So, on connectivity, if we're thinking about the changing role that business is expected to play by society, and you have lots of customers, you're not one of those businesses that works mostly with other businesses. How easy it is to change a company, to pivot an organization with 150,000 employees and huge legacy of success in the businesses where you already are?
I think it's being changed not from within, but from outside. It's that human element. Our customers are a new generation. They're looking to do business with companies that understand that. They're looking to make sure that they're working at places where the company understands in their culture that doing the right thing for the world and for business can meet. So we're really seeing that change happen just with our employee base and with our consumer base, because yes, we have a large business to business, but we also have a very large, in the United States, consumer business. So it's that combination of external, internal influences that are really going to change who Verizon is over the next 10 years.
So in thinking about consumers and the public more generally, I guess all four of you are to some degree in the space of trying to engage with and in some cases educate the population about some of the challenges that you tackle. And you, Christer, have now gone back to academia and are a professor. I also read somewhere that you've written some books for children. Is that just a rumor? Yes?
Yeah, that's right.
So
try to make things curious.
What do you think? How can we understand what it takes to change the way that people think about some of these challenges and systems? Is there something about the way that we educate people or the way that we engage with children that you think could be helpful?
If we take the example of the climate problem, everyone knows we have a problem. At least most people knows. But if you've seen it with your own eyes, how thin the atmosphere really is. I mean, it's a very thin layer on top of the Earth. And you see that from space, it looks really fragile. And at the same time, you're living in a spaceship, you have very careful taking care of your environment in there, because if anything goes wrong, you don't have a lot of time to survive. And you see, well, we better do the same thing with our environment on this planet, which is to some extent the spaceship of all humanity. Now, everyone mentally could understand, but somehow if you've seen it with your own eyes, you become an eyewitness, and it kind of carries more authority. At least that's what my boss told me at ISA one time. So I try to live up to that. Now, also starting from early on to pick up on the children books, the children books are written, try to be a fun, interesting story, but also put in pieces of science in there, including things about climate to get the children curious and want to learn more, and from the very beginning, I believe children, they can understand things much more than grown-up believe.
So I really love this idea of the eyewitness, because in a way, I think all of you are really at the frontiers witnessing some of the growing pains that we've experienced now as in European society and in northern Norway, as you're describing. And this room, in fact, is full of other kinds of eyewitnesses, which we'll get to hear about later over the course of these 2 days. So given the fact that it's so much wealth and having diversity of opinions, I have to ask Yanis about democracy. And we heard some powerful comments from President Calderon earlier about what it takes to keep democracy alive and what we should pin our hopes on. What do you feel we should pin our hopes on in this next decade when it comes to democracy?
Well, democracy is the most fragile of flowers. There are a million different ways of trampling it. Donald Trump is doing a pretty good job. Matteo Salvini in Italy is fantastic at it. But at the same time, there are many other threats that democracy faces. The European Union is very much like the moon, in the sense that there is no deficit of oxygen on the moon. There's just no oxygen. Similarly, in the European Union, there's no deficit of democracy. There is no democracy in the European Union itself, in Brussels. We have democratic states, but we have this amazing paradox of democratic states bound together and shifting many important decisions into a democracy-free zone in Brussels. I'm saying this as a Europeanist, somebody who aches for the European Union and does not want to see the continued disintegration of the European Union. And the only way of stopping it is by democratizing, creating a federal government. So, to cut a long story short, we can't agree entirely on what democratization means. We agree, I think, that democracy is very easy to destroy flower. There are many different threats to it. It is important to reinvent democracy because it is the only way of reinventing growth, and in a way that doesn't trample upon the interests of communities and people, the very same people that supposedly are to be served by democracy.
Aili, does that resonate with you, this idea of democracy as needing to reinvent itself in order for us to reinvent growth?
Well, and I think that the Sámi parliament, as an indigenous parliament within a national state like Norway, is a part of stretching the democracy, making it bigger and better. And I certainly hope that more indigenous peoples and minorities are able to have a voice within the state democracies, and of course on the global international level as well. But I would like to return to the concept of growth and reinventing growth. We have a Sámi core value, which is called Birgijomi. And it's not really about growth, or it's about moderation. It's about not taking more than you really need, about saving something for the future, saving something for future generations. And this, if Birgen and Birgijomi could be about a part of the new growth, then it might be something that also indigenous peoples like our people will be able to relate to and to trust, because democracy is also about trust.
Thank you so much. I think that's a beautiful note to end on, and this has been a very wide-ranging conversation. We've been to space, we've been to the Arctic Circle, but I think one interesting thing that really stuck with me is this idea of when we use the word we, Christer, that you mentioned, when do we feel like we actually have enough shared ownership in, to use this ownership word, in a vision and a solution that that can inspire us to all collaborate and share in a feeling of success. So I hope this conversation has given all of us some food for thought when we think about some of the complexities that we need to understand as we manage systems challenges. We'll be working a lot more on a lot of these things in the coming 2 days. So please join me in giving a warm thank you to our amazing speakers.
Thank you.
What a timing.